considering fitting ways to commemorate our 50th anniversary, the propriety of naming our monuments to perpetuate the memory of our stalwarts was impatient of debate. This project has marked the climax of our commemorative activities. In these closing weeks of the year, we have honored former Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Leslie Robinson, the first person to take up the reins of principal at the then College of Arts and Sciences, after whom an area of the old administration block has been named. Sir Sidney Martin, who followed him 1 year later in 1964 as the campus's first substantive principal, after whom we named our main library just 1 week ago, and most recently, Sir Keith Hunt, whose name our newest Hall of Residence proudly bears. And today, the moving finger having writ moves on, but with none of the cynicism and predestination with which those words were authored. It moves to record in celebration the name of Woodville Kemble Marshall. Well, not all of it, but, but sufficient to ensure that he is remembered by future generations for the reasons we salute him today, one of the builders of the Cave Hill campus and a stalwart of our regional university, which he has served for 36 years. Professor Emeritus Sir Woodville Marshall is, as am I, a product of the Republic of St. Philip, except that he is a citizen by birth, while I was given immigrant status, having arrived at a tender age from the parish of St. John. He entered UE in 1954, beginning a long relationship with the university, which throughout its transitions and interruptions would be sustained over most of his life. Sir Woodville joined the Cave Hill campus in 1970 as a senior lecturer in history, following 6 years at Mona, where his scholarship had merited him advancement, and his commitment to the collegial culture, as evidenced by his presidency of the Mona Senior Common Room, had already brought him much acclaim. His success in the latter regard would ensure that he was again pressed into the service of the Collegium in a similar capacity during his tenure at Cave Hill. In honoring him today, we recognize his multifaceted contribution, his advancement of his discipline, his institution, and through these media in part, to the education of his community along its path to self-awareness. What I mentioned here today are but signposts, as many speakers will treat in depth with Sir Woodville's many firsts, not only the first-class honors degree he gained from the Mona campus on his graduation in 1954, then a very, very rare achievement, but also his appointment in 1977 as the first professor in the Department of History at Cave Hill, a department which, as both head and professor, he nurtured for many years, and the progeny of which are represented here today. He is believed, too, to be the first Commonwealth scholar to be awarded the PhD, which he gained from Cambridge University in 1962. We will hear today of Sir Woodville's contribution to institution building, his vision as a foundation member of the Association of Caribbean Historians, his role in the discussions which led to the establishment of the faculty and departmental structures at Cave Hill and St. Augustine, which mirrored those of the Mona campus, and to the deliberations which led to the merger of the faculties of Arts and General Studies into a single Faculty of Arts and General Studies, and in that context, another first, in 1972, when he was appointed University Dean of the merged faculty. Professor Marshall served as Deputy Principal from 1990 to 1993. The portfolio he subsequently held as Pro-Vice Chancellor until his retirement in 2000. There were two portfolios, and they were both particularly challenging ones and new within the university structure. First, as PVC Academic Affairs, his portfolio, following the 1996 restructuring, actually mutated into two substantive portfolios of undergraduate studies and graduate studies. From 1996, he held the portfolio of non-campus PVC, non-campus countries and distance education, in which he was charged with reshaping the nature of the university's relationship with its wider constituency. Professor Marshall was in 2001 knighted by Her Majesty the Queen for his services to education in Barbados. To all of these assignments, Professor Marshall brought his prodigious intellectual talents, his rapier-like wit and incisiveness. I recall as a student, both a graduate and undergraduate, witnessing many a presentation in which Professor Marshall sat and received the presentation in his characteristic pose of reflection, only to emerge at the end with a dreaded comment, "Yes, but what's the point?" So, Professor Marshall, many of your students thank you for those lessons in critical thinking long before this became a popular part of our curriculum. All knew, too, of his preference for, as Mandela once enjoined the clerk to practice, putting his cards on the table face upwards, an interesting attribute for a poker player. Today is a day of many nights. Sir Hilary Beckles, our principal and pro-vice chancellor, and our first principal, our first speaker, I'm sorry, how could I do that? Our first speaker. There have been a lot of these over a space of time. Our first speaker, I truly believe, lives by the maxim attributable to someone whom I do not now recall, that a ship is safe in harbor, but that is not what ships are made for. So rapidly has he been accumulating honors, distinctions, and plaudits that to list them is to risk immediate obsolescence. He is, as most of us know, had a long association with Professor Marshall. To speak one luminary of another, I invite to the podium our Principal and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Sir Hilary Beckles.
You will see that only historians are speaking today. I saw that this morning, and I wish to let you know that that was not my design. It just happened that way. It is one of those circumstances, and this is why I do not believe in capital punishment. Because circumstances can so co-join as to create guilt even where there's innocence. And that includes Jackie, because as you know, Jackie is a graduate of the history program. So the loyalty goes on. In fact, that also explains why the Minister of Education is here, I suspect, because he has not attended any of the others, but he's here for this one. And I suspect that has to do something with being a history graduate as well. So you see, the loyalty has a strange way of bringing everyone together, but we are very proud of that. But we continue our celebration and the paying of gratitude to those who have built our beloved institution. Last night, Professor Marshall and I attended a function, the launch of a book by a young 17-year-old Canadian girl, Shireen Shabab, who has written a brilliant 474-page novel that is sweeping the world. And she started her presentation, her oral presentation, with a quotation from Plato. Now, it's not often that 17-year-olds are quoting Plato. And she quoted him, she said, "Children are allowed to be afraid of the dark." And this is Plato. But when adults are afraid of the light, that is something altogether very different. Now, I wish to use that to frame the comments I wish to make in respect of our honorary Professor Woodville Marshall. I often forgot the Kimball part of it. I always associate that with television movies, and I don't know if you all were fans of The Fugitive, one Richard Kimball, who entertained us for many years. Kimball is, oh, I'm getting But the notion of adults being afraid of the dark, being afraid of the light, is very disturbing, and it was disturbing to play to 2,000 years ago. And when we have persons who, in the midst of a circumstance that requires leadership, rise to provide it and to go into the light fearlessly, then you see the making of your personality. And my reflections on Woodville's journey, and I have been a part of it because I met Woodville at the Public Records Office in London when I was a graduate student. And we met in the research facility there. That was 1978. I was involved in writing my PhD, and I met the professor who had come over to do his research. And within a year, I think he had written to the Mona campus to say, there's a fella up in England called Beckers, you might wish to use him. And I ended up in Mona. But that is how it has been these past 33, 34 years. But Woodville is a legend, not only at the Cave campus, he is a legend within the University of the West Indies. And it's important to feel the gravity of that, because if you travel across the environment of UWI, departments, faculties, campuses, and when you think of the intellectual stalwarts of this university, when you think of the academics who have built a reputation for our university and who have laid the intellectual infrastructure for a young and emerging university, Woodville Marshall is one of those pillars of the UWI. And across the university, that is how he is known. He is an icon of our intellectual structures. And that has been the case now for 40 years. Because as a young academic in the faculty, in the university, both Mona and KFL, and of course his journeys into St. Augustine, that is how he was seen as a brilliant young scholar, giving the social sciences and historical reflection a reputation. Now, Woodville chose as his research subject the study of the Caribbean working class. Now, understand, to choose in the 1960s and so on that your research discipline is going to be a study of the working poor, of the laborers of the plantations, the peasants, the persons who created the villages across the Caribbean. To choose that as a subject, that was what I call Plato's point in action, an adult not afraid of the light. And it was an important part of the decolonization of Caribbean intellectual traditions, to turn the world upside down, to say that it is ordinary men and women who are responsible for advancing history, achieving social change, pushing for human rights, pushing for civil rights. The working people can be oftentimes agents for social change and social transformation, and that the world we live in today has a great deal to do with the efforts of working people for social betterment. Now, in that journey, you would have heard from Jackie, Woodville was no easy taskmaster. Not only for his students, but for his colleagues. Because all of us who wrote manuscripts would ask Woodville if he could throw his eyes on the manuscript before you send it off to a publisher, to a journal, to a university press. And I believe Woodville has probably read everything I have written, because you didn't feel comfortable unless Woodville had looked at it for you and criticized it. And believe me, every I had to be dotted, every T crossed, and respect for the evidence. If there was any departure from a commitment to the empirical framework of the analysis. Well, you heard what Jackie said. It was, and a whole generation of us grew up with that critical scrutiny of our work. And you need that in an institution, especially when you are young and you are emerging. You need that mentoring and you need that scrutiny. He was the most hostile person to sloppiness that I know. And intemperate, because he would not hide it. If it was sloppy, you would know. And I know that there were many people who left his office heartbroken because he was not gentle. Now, you know, it was interesting when Woodville spoke at Key's function. And he said, well, you know, some people said that my people skills were not the best. That is true. That is true. Because his commitment to the truth, his commitment to telling you the truth was so complete that he did not spare your feelings. He gave you the truth because that is what you needed to go forward. And it takes time. It takes time to learn to respect that. You know, when you're young, it hurts a little bit. You know, when you're told it's not good enough, go back and start again. But that is what you need. And these are the kinds of persons who build scholastic traditions that can stand. So in the humanities and the social sciences also, Woodville is a colossus. Now, then there was the model that he was building for the rest of us. And the model building is important. And here's the model, that you can be an effective academic and be an effective administrator. That is the model. Because in most universities, traditions have been, if you are committed to scholastic work, you avoid administration. Or if you love administration and you're good at it, well, you abandon research and scholarship. Either or. And that is a global standard. What Woodville taught this university and two generations that came after him is that we cannot afford that division of labor. Neither can we not afford it. It is not good for our institution. That if you're going to be a scholar, you can be a scholar and an administrator simultaneously, and that is what we need because we cannot afford any other division. And so Woodville became a brilliant administrator. Head of the Department of History, Dean of the Faculty, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Deputy Principal, all of that, an excellent administrator, while at the same time not abandoning his commitment to his research and to his publishing agenda. And CAFIL, therefore, in its infancy, needed scholars of that quality. And I think that, for the record, there's some things that we have to say. It seemed to me that when the CAFIL campus was built, and Mona was already dynamic and expanding, Mona was pulling onto itself the finest scholars. The finest Caribbean scholars were drawn to Mona because Mona was the center. And a fledgling campus out there in Barbados had to compete with Mona for the fine scholars. And those fine scholars who came to CAFIL and laid the foundation for a scholastic tradition for a campus in its infancy, that is something, again, that has to be celebrated and respected. Because, you know, I don't know how Sir Keith used to cope with this in his role as principal at university meetings, but there used to be this feeling, you know, well, the university is made up of Mona campus, and then we have two other community colleges, one in Trinidad and one in CAFIL. But these small campuses had to fight their way up to Mona's standard, and Mona had set the standard for our university. And CAFIL and St. Augustine had to fight their way up to get the respect of Mona, and we did. But that was not an easy task. It required the scholars and the administrators at Cave Hill and Mona and St. Augustine to fight that battle and to level the playing field eventually between the campus. And we're not boasting this morning, but here are two small issues. PVC Hunt, Wayne Hunt, PVC for Research, last year did a very interesting analysis. His analysis of publications across the 3 campuses. Peer-reviewed publications in academic journals, books published by distinguished university presses, and in his analysis across the 3 campuses, Cave Hill was number 1. Now, that is not a boast, but that is just a statement of the journey that Cave Hill has taken. The journey it has taken, standing on the shoulders of people like Professor Marshall and all of the young scholars who are here, who are publishing more work in academic journals and published by presses than the other campuses on a per capita basis. That is a remarkable achievement. And just this week, Professor Ventos is here. Professor Ventos, it is not a coincidence that he's at Cave Hill, the youngest professor in the history of UWI at Cave Hill, and that is just a reflection of the times. He is just a reflection of the times. And this week, we are launching the first ever postgraduate conference in UWI. All of those students who are doing MPhils and PhDs, there is a conference of postgraduate students here at Cave Hill starting tomorrow. And this is a phenomenal achievement. But we could only have done this on the basis of the platform built of scholarship and research, and Cave Hill is now out there in a space by itself. We are now out there in a space by ourselves, and we can go on. So, having said all of that, then I can only conclude that this ceremony this morning and this honoring of Sir Woodville is entirely appropriate, justified, and right. It is right for all of the reasons I have given, that he is a pillar and a legend within our university and our campus, and we cannot imagine what it would have been like without him providing his leadership on so many fronts in this university. And I would have to end on a personal note. I owe Woodville a great deal, because Woodville has been a mentor to me as a young academic. He is responsible for my being in the university in the first place. Because I remember on completing my PhD, like many young people, I was offered a job at a British university, and Woodville called and says, come back to the Caribbean. And I was tossing and turning. My family was in England, and I was grown up in England, and I wanted to be in England. And Woodville says, no, you need to return to the Caribbean. And on his persuasion, I returned to the Caribbean and also to Mona. And it was also his intervention, and I hope he has no regrets, for bringing me back to Cave Hill. For bringing me back to Cave Hill at the time when Sir Keith became the principal, and very kind of him, opened up a vacancy in the history department. Very generous. And again, Woodville says, no, Beckers, you, airplane, Cave Hill. And for all of those, I express my appreciation and my gratitude to him for his friendship, for his mentorship. And I pay enough respect, as the young people of Jamaica will say, walk tall. Thank you all very much.
Of course, our lineup of speakers and the fact that they're all historians may indeed be serendipity, but nobody better understands than historians the need to celebrate persons of historic significance in order to ensure that our history's narrative places them appropriately, as indeed Sir Woodville should be. Our next speaker, our former principal, Sir Keith Hunt, was paid touching and a thoughtful tribute by Sir Woodville just over a week ago when we opened the Keith Hunt Hall. Sir Woodville spoke then of a shared trajectory. But from days of yore, knights have had a right of reply to any charge. Today, thankfully, they joust only in words which draw no blood. I welcome to the podium our former principal and a pro-vice chancellor, Sir Keith Hunt, his right of rebuttal.
Honorable Minister of Education and Human Resources, Chairman of the Campus Council, Principal and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Sir Hilary Beckles, and the person of the moment, Professor Sir Woodville Marshall, and the members of the Marshall family, colleagues, because I speak for you, whether you wish it to expect or not, ladies and gentlemen. In a number of ways, the principal, as is his right, has stolen much of my thunder, but that means that I can stay within the 5-minute restriction that I have. But what I penned last evening, and I still think it's appropriate for me to begin by saying, it's the right thing to do that on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of our university at Cave Hill, University campus at Cave Hill, we recognize and memorialize the outstanding contribution that Woodville Marshall has made to the university over a long and distinguished career that got underway in 1954 when he matriculated at the University College of the West Indies, having just won the highly competitive UCWI, University College of the West Indies Open Scholarship. Through a career as a brilliant undergraduate that culminated with his obtaining first-class honors in history and winning again the coveted Dulverton Overseas Postgraduate Scholarship that took him to the University of Cambridge and along a path that would lead to his becoming a leader in the academic community of our regional university. But the principal has exposed our flank. This, I almost said, group of historians that show up everywhere and in every position. And we had, therefore, always to say we were not picked only because of our historical scholarship. But I will assure those who are not familiar with the university, we do have a very democratic system. And I'm not sure that anybody who sought to be dean or any of these offices has found a way to do a coup before his colleagues agreed that they would give him a try. And there's always a recall, for there is a limited number of years. It is appropriate that I highlight significant aspects of Professor Marshall's contribution to the university, but I will not overlap with what has been said before more than I need to. Apart from his initial appointment to the Department of History at the University of Ibadan in 1962-63, Woodville's entire academic career has been spent at the university. Mona, 1964 to 70, Cave Hill, 1970 to 2000. Perhaps in certain departments and faculties today, given the attainment of a critical mass of staff and resources, colleagues may be able to boast, or rather have it to forego being capped and taken to do administrative office if they ought, in their own interest and in the interest of the university, to establish a research base, to settle themselves in teaching, and perhaps postpone that. What I would wish to observe, that for at least the first 25 years, that was a luxury at the Cave Hill campus and at its sister College of Arts and Science at St. Augustine, where a complement of 4 in a department, that was the history faculty. As a consequence, similarly in English, and when a new subject comes on, there were sometimes, like in economics, 2. But these were growing pains, and I think that we survived, and that I'm here to stand up and speak means that hard work is not necessarily fatal. So, Notwithstanding all of that, by some stroke of good fortune for this campus, Woodville opted to leave the center of the universe and to come to Cave Hill as senior lecturer. But as he himself reflected when he was giving generous compliments in my direction, no sooner had he arrived than a succession of administrative positions were forced on him, and for the reason that from the start, his all-round competence, first, as an academic, secondly, as a historian, but not just that. Woodville, in a meeting, regardless of the topic, would not be able to leave the room unless he pointed out the fallacies on the basis of which an argument seemed to be gaining ground. So in time, we recognize that must be what a university community is about. And as a consequence, not only did we applaud it, we kept him in a position where we as a campus and as a university could continue to benefit from his leadership. Notice I saying leadership, because I do not know a single occasion on which Woodville could be accused of wanting to take over responsibility. But effectively, if the job was being done well, you could count on his support. If the job was not being done well, you can't get his support, and you would know what to do. What is the scorecard? In sum, Woodville delivered the goods. Whether it was in relation to consolidating and building the discipline of history at this campus, getting us started on building a postgraduate program, which was something that we would probably not have been able to do, a master's program at this campus, notwithstanding pressure of resources, etc. Leading by example in emphasizing the importance of research and publications, lobbying the campus librarian, and I recognize Michael Gill, who would have been at the receiving end of this for part of his time, the head of government archives, and the head of Barbados Public Library, to pool their slender budgetary resources to build up, and the Department of History, because we led, to build up a resource distributed between the university library, the archives, and the public library. Since these were government funds, Minister, let me assure you, we did not use government funds to bring the documents here. But what we had is a union catalog where students could go to any library and indicate that series XYZ would be there. But without that, what was the option? The option was to plan to take your study leave and to spend 2 or so months in London. No wonder then that with that thinking, because it didn't stop there, we were able to reach the pinnacle, and let me applaud the principal for bringing to our attention the fact that I think Mona St. Augustine must have worries if they have the same data as you have. But something right went on for some of the time at Cave Hill, and believe me, Woodville's contribution to that was very significant. He made his mark also on the wider academic community. As university dean, as deputy principal, pro-vice chancellor academic affairs, pro-vice chancellor in on-campus countries and distance education, chairman of the University Archives and Records Management Committee, and chairman of the University Press. The one comment I would wish to make, because I would have been on some of these committees, and I'm certainly very aware, there is a tendency for uninitiated chairmen and heads of committees to brief themselves fully on what happened before. Very good. To the extent that Woodville did that, he was focused on what we should be doing in the next 5 years. And I think that that emphasis cannot be more strongly done. It's not occupying a position. Leadership means making the best use of available resources, strategizing to increase the resources to enable us to do the tasks that need to be done. And I'm saying that Woodville, not alone, but he leads the pack of persons who effectively got us to the position where we now can fully support the principal's very exciting prospect of shifting gears in relation to meeting critical manpower needs in the area of the region that we serve. However, I can't end this without going back to base. It is in the area of the advancement of his discipline, history, via research, teaching, and especially his contribution to the building of the Association of Caribbean Historians, from very modest beginnings to its becoming the dynamic forum for teachers. And again, it's good news to hear about the meeting of postgraduate students. What a treat for students in harness to be able to have that kind of engagement. But yes, the road traveled, and where we have researchers and students in Caribbean history that Woodville can justifiably claim to be part of an important success story that has made a difference to the careers of us historians and to successive cadres of researchers in Caribbean history. But lest he should think that I'm allowing interhall rivalry to omit from his very distinguished CV, I will correct that omission with immediate effect. For Woodville is the holder of the Super Lion Award of Chancellor Hall, which doesn't go to you until you have graduated and earned it. And I think this was about 2000. And therefore, from across the way, Woodville, I recognize I cannot trump you on that. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said at the beginning, it is only fitting that we meet today to salute the multifaceted contribution of Professor Sir Woodville Marshall to this university. Thank you.
Professor Emeritus Alvin Thompson and Sir Woodville were colleagues in the Department of History, now History and Philosophy, for many decades. Decades of collaboration with others in building a department whose ability to, over the years, regenerate itself through those whom it has taught and nurtured is testament to its success. They have together, as we have heard, built a formidable tradition of scholarship, which continues, and in which retirement has meant for them both only a change in certain contractual relationships. Professor Thompson has won a number of awards for his scholarly work. These include the Principal's Award for Excellence, 2005, the Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence, 2007, the University of the West Indies Press Lifetime Achievement Award, 2008, and the Lifetime Award from the Pan-African Commission of Barbados for contribution to the study of African history and culture in 2008. These are a few only. Many of us today who are under this tent are unaware of our indebtedness to him for his services on Wigot. But rest assured that there are many benefits we now enjoy, which we enjoy only because of his tenacious advocacy. I now welcome to the podium Professor Emeritus Alvin Thompson.
As I stand here, I remember the story of a layperson sitting between a rabbi and an apostle, an Old Testament and a New Testament official carrying on a very deep discussion on religion, and he didn't have anything to say. But the only thing he could remember or to say was that he felt like the page between the Old and the New Testament. To which the rabbi quickly rejoined, that page is usually a blank. And that is how I feel at this moment. So you will sympathize with me. Nevertheless, it is my pleasure, indeed my honor, to say a few words on this occasion. And I take courage in the fact that I understand that Woodville has asked that I say a few words. So I have been the appointed one, if not the anointed one. I was a student of Woodville at Mona when he came to the campus in 1964. At that time, he taught North American history. But of course, we moved on, and I took up an appointment in Guyana, the University of Guyana. I was troubled by what I was seeing happening at the university, where politics was intervening in the daily life of academics under the Danforth-Burnham regime, and felt that the time for me was to leave, at least to go somewhere else for a short time, perhaps to Mona, perhaps to Africa. In 1972, Woodville came to see me on campus. I didn't know why he was coming to see me, but he invited me to come to Cave Hill to teach African history. At the time, an African was teaching African history, but just for 1 year, and he was leaving. And here was I, still young scholar, invited to come. I was uncertain because I never had Barbados on the map of places to which I should go. But Woodville had invited me. I don't know if you remember coming to me and asking me about it. And I'm still here. I haven't gone to Africa, I haven't gone to Jamaica, I'm still here. So he successfully recruited me. And I think that we can say over the years, not simply for myself, I was, I think, the sole Africanist on campus until 1986, but then we recruited a number of persons, Professor Cobley, Richard Goodridge, a number of persons, and developed a wide and, I would like to say, a very dynamic African program. And as I understand it, the principal is moving towards developing graduate studies in African history, not only in, well, I should say African studies, not only history, but linguistics and so on. We have had several African studies programs. So in that respect, I must pay tribute to Woodville for his insight in ensuring that the African studies program did not die out. The other thing in which, or way in which I remember Woodville academically is for his contribution to the Journal of Caribbean History. I'm just picking a few points, areas, because the general framework has been well sketched out. The Journal of African History remains the premier, one indeed would say, the only journal within the Caribbean, and indeed in any part of the world dedicated specifically to Caribbean historical writing. Woodville was not the founder of that journal. He was one of the early persons promoting the journal, and at one stage, in order to ensure that the journal did not die out, he actually brought the journal to the campus. He ensured that it had a house, a staff. Sardis, who is here, will probably remember having to do some extra work to keep the journal alive and so forth and so on. And the journal stayed on this campus for 10 or more years. It has gone back to Mona, but during that time, we were able to give character, a structure and character to the journal. It remains the premier journal in the region and in the world. So again, in that area of academia, Woodville played a significant part. Sakit mentioned his contribution in terms of the Association of Caribbean Historians. What he did not say was Woodville was one of 3 founder members of the Association of Caribbean Historians. And if you look at his CV, he is now an honorary life member. The other person was Professor Douglas Hall, deceased, and I believe is Mar Adelaide from Martinique, you know. And they give character to the association. Again, the Association of Caribbean Historians is by far the premier institution. In fact, it's the only institution in the region specifically dedicated to the study of history. It meets annually. It draws its membership not only throughout the Caribbean, but also from North America and Europe. And I believe Woodville still goes every year to its meeting. So he has played a tremendous role in that regard too. Mention was made of postgraduate studies, both by Sir Hilary and Sir Keith, and we have to endorse that. And we also need to point out that at one point, he was the head of graduate studies. He was resident at Cave Hill, but he had the entire UWI as his framework. And again, he played a very important role in that regard. No discussion of his contribution should neglect his work on the Windward Islands. Professor Douglas Hall was known for his work on the Leeward Islands. But Professor Marshall paid attention both as a postgraduate student and otherwise to the Windward Islands. And he has wrote a number of things on the Windward Islands, and also he has sought to bring back a large part of the archives in microfilm form and house it in our library. I believe that the collection includes a considerable amount of information on Barbados, but also the Windward Islands. I don't know if the students are using it. At some point, I know microfilm readers died a very quick death. I hope they've been replaced by more sturdy ones. I say that because at one point I had to put a stick, this is no fault of Michael Gill, in the microfilm reader to turn it, right? Since those days where the library was kept in penury, it was not Michael's fault, you know. It was how the library was financed and what the money could do. But I trust that the library is much better endowed. I'm going through these things very quickly, but they show you the ambit of the man's work, range of interest. And he also, as Hilary mentioned, undertook work in relation to the working people, the peasantries in particular. He has written several studies on Caribbean peasantries. And one or two of his studies, which are really in the form of articles, set the foundation for later works in that area. And they have become seminal works mentioned time and again. We also need to single out in some detail the university press. And I'm indebted to him for promoting the press, because a lot of us do not know that we struggled for a long time to get the press going, a university press. You might say a university press is synonymous with doing any kind of scholarship within a university context. For UWI, it was not so. And this was largely because of financial problems, because everybody could have seen the academic argument for it. But nobody seemed to think that we could finance the press, and of course, if we did finance the press, how we could compete with bigger presses such as Oxford University Press, Cambridge University, and so forth. And we still have that problem today because we can't reach as deeply into those libraries and so who automatically buy anything that's produced by Oxford and Cambridge. You know, you just send it to them and they buy it. It is not so for us, as we have found out. But Woodville was very instrumental, along with James Millett and a few others, in getting the university to undertake the establishment of the press. And today we have a functional press. You would have heard that I was the recipient of a lifetime award by the University Press. Just imagine if you didn't do it, Woodville, I would not have had that award. I'm not sure if I'm the only person so far, but I am particularly grateful for that outlet, that contribution. And of course, the University Press serves a wider function because works that we may find difficult to publish, not because of their scholarship, but because they're oriented towards the Caribbean, a rather small area, and the bigger presses will not take them because they cannot see any financial benefit. The University Press is prepared to publish. Of course, it needs much more money than it is getting, and I hope that somewhere along the line we'll at least get a benefactor to keep this aspect of our work going. In these and many other ways, I could pay tribute to the work that Woodville has done inside the faculty, outside the faculty, in the university. Looking at his CV, and I conclude with this, I would have thought that after having spent 36 years at the university, having retired, he would have gone into splendid isolation. But it seems from the CV that Woodville is much, much more active in academia than during his time, comparatively, I would say, in the wider university community because of the wide range of things he was doing. And I know he said that he wanted to devote this time to academia, but it seems as though he has at least a dozen things going at one time, while I'm striving to get one done. So the man who is so many years older than I am not saying he's an old man. Though I feel like an old man. He is as active as ever, and he is launching a new book. Congratulations, Woodville, ladies and gentlemen.
A number of persons, having been invited to attend this morning, have expressed a deep regret that they were unable to do so. One of these is Alistair McIntyre, who has sent these words. I am delighted by the decision to name a building after Woodville Marshall. He has been a tower of strength in this university throughout his career and continues to be supportive. It is fitting to name a building after him, not only in recognition of what he has done, but in gratitude for what he will do in the future. And from Professor Emeritus Edward Ball, I am pleased to have been given the privilege of adding a few hurried words to this occasion of honoring someone whom I have known as a colleague and friend for a very long time. The link between us is enhanced by the fact that I taught for 3 years at Cave Hill and consider Barbados my second island home. Woodville first came unforgettably to my notice in my first year, perhaps my first term as an undergraduate at Mona. In those days, students in the Faculty of Arts read either for a general degree or an honors degree. For the latter, one majored in a particular subject. However, everyone had to read in the first year for the general degree. It was on the basis of one's showing during that first year that one was elevated, if one so desired, to the honors program. In the first year general degree program in English, taught by Professor A.K. Croston, there was a course in practical criticism of poetry. In one early class, the professor was commenting on what we had written by way of an appreciation of a particular poem. In going over the work submitted, he said that the only person who had got the poem right was Woodville Marshall. That name would have remained forever stamped in my memory, even if I had never seen or heard of him again. And so Woodville came awesomely to my notice. When I returned to Mona in 1968 to teach, Woodville was established in the history department and was already making a name for himself for his outstanding scholarship and teaching. He stands out in my mind as a model of the cool and unflappable at work, in social gatherings, and in dress, his trademark Liberty cotton shirts, and his generally neat and trim bearing. Some years ago, I tried to memorialize him in a poem called Old Talk or West Indian History, a poem that recalls those nights of veranda talk at some colleague's house after a day of university meetings. These specific lines say, cut their names in the bark of this verse: Woodville Marshall, Keith Hunt, Bill and Nora Mailer, Joy Pilgrim, Lawrence, and the chief bearded reveler at this wake, the onlyest raconteur, Ogier Roy. You will notice, incidentally, that 4 of the 7 persons mentioned are historians. At one time, the university was virtually run by historians. I pause for comment from the floor. But not least of them Woodville. It was good to know him. And now, friends, colleagues, distinguished guests, the reason we are all here, our honoree, Sir Woodville Marshall.
There are a few things that I should say as comments on what has been said earlier. One has to do with the choice of the research topic. This is from Hillary, and it made me sound, quite radical in my thinking at that age. And I would like to say that I was not as radical as it might sound. The topic, or rather the general area of the topic, was actually proposed by Elsa Gavaya. And some of you will know, I have said it often, I owe her such a great debt. She was, of course, a great and influential teacher of mine. So Elsa said, well, why don't you look at the Windward Islands? She didn't say what area of the Windward Islands. So at least I can take credit for the fact that I decided to look at how social adjustments did in fact take place in the Windward Islands after slave emancipation. I think I need just to say that because I don't want it to be thought that I knew it all at a very early age. That might have changed later, though. The other thing that I would like to say, too, is this, that people talk about the extent to which I was a little bit rigorous in terms of my comments on other people's work. Again, I make no apology for that, but I would like to say that the source for it, is partly one of my teachers again. This is Roy O.J. Roy O.J. subjected us to this. You would make a comment, and he would say, why? And of course, unfortunately, some of his students could never answer. In fact, some of them burst into tears. Now, I think that he spared me some of that, perhaps because I had a little bit of confidence. But more important, I suspect that he realized that I was understanding what he was trying to do. And if in fact, therefore, I learned anything about how one should approach teaching and how anything about method, I did learn it from O.J. And I'm glad to hear from some of my students that I've been practicing it ever since. The other thing that I need to say, also to set the record, just to modify the record a little bit, is about the university press. Yes, it is true that I played a role in establishing the university press, but it must be understood that in a sense I was doing a job. one of the first things that was said to me by the Vice Chancellor, Alistair McIntyre, when I took up the post of Pro Vice Chancellor, Academic Affairs, he said, "You will have to bring the press on stream." So therefore, he charged my office with bringing it on stream. So that the idea, rather the decision to establish a press was Alistair McIntyre's. Bringing it on stream, implementing it, well, I think that my office can take some of the credit for that. So again, I would like to make it fairly clear. And finally, in terms of those introductory comments, I would like to say something about coming to Cave Hill. Because again, I don't think I can take a great deal of credit for coming, in the sense that I had the opportunity to be historic in that sense, meaning by that I could have been the first person teaching history at this campus. I was actually offered the job. I was offered the job in the summer of 1963. But when I was offered the job, Elsa Gavaya, who was then visiting London, said, "Ignore it. Another offer is coming to you from Mona." And let me say, and I don't apologize for that. I mean, my choice was obviously to return to Mona for me, and Hillary, of course, is indicating that was the center of the campus, and you could understand, therefore, why a young scholar with some ambitions might have wanted to go there. Now, coming to Cave Hill, however, was not a result of a late recognized wish to build up the institution of my campus, institution of my country. It was not that either. I came to Cave Hill mainly because life at Mona started to become, rather life in Jamaica started to become a little bit intolerable. Some of you will remember, this is the Rodney time. And then, of course, a number of us from the Eastern Caribbean were automatically suspect as subversives. And therefore, it seemed as though, at least for some time, some of us would be treated like second-class citizens. I resolved then that I didn't want either myself or particularly my family to grow up in Jamaica being treated as second-class citizens. And I reasoned that I could not be deported from Barbados. Therefore, I said to my head of department, "I think I better go home." And he seconded the motion. I think he had another agenda. He seconded it. This is Douglas Hall. He seconded the motion, and he arranged the transfer. So, I mean, I'm not regretting the change. All I'm just trying to do is to put the record straight. Now, let me all now say that on a few occasions since I retired from paid employment in this university, that was some 13 years ago, I have been the fortunate recipient of send-off presents of one sort or other. And I've accepted those presents in the spirit in which they were given, because I saw them as mainly goodbye tokens. And therefore, I have been very careful about the extent to which I could be said, like Errol Barrow, to be loitering on these premises. But this honor, whether it is deserved or not, is altogether of a different order. And I am somewhat at a loss as to how to respond to it. By prominently displaying my name on what used to be the lead faculty on this campus, it could be said that I've been summoned back to the campus to become a fixture. Or you might even say that I might have been resurrected. But resurrection, as you know, or as I might suspect, has a sparse literature. And therefore, unless I indulge in sacrilege, it does not give me a guide as to how to respond. Because, you know, me being a historian, being a literate person, I tend, of course, to go to literature for guides as to what I might do. So I have a problem, therefore, with the appropriate response. So I suppose the best that I can do is to say thanks to all of those, particularly thanks to you, Principal, who decided to confer this honor. However, I must say that in accepting the honor, I do so with some mixed feelings. Of course, like most people, I like recognition. But this honor could be said to be both recognition and imposition. Why? It is one thing to honor the dead in this way. They have no behaviors to answer for, no CVs to defend. But it is clearly of a different order to honor the living by putting their names, by shouting to the world that their names are now in stone or in metal. As a result, these individuals may be under constant scrutiny by both supporters and detractors alike. And they, that is, those honors, might at least have to share the responsibility for defending their own high visibility. But all the same, thank you. And I hope that I can discharge the onerous responsibilities that go with the honor. I must, of course, thank all of those who, during my 30 years of service to this campus, or on this campus, gave me support of one sort or other. And I'm pleased to see many of them here this morning. Because, and I would insist upon this, whatever I may have achieved in this place was largely the product of the environment in which I found myself. And of course, it is an environment on which, according to you at least, it is an environment on which I might have made some slight impact. What I single out in that environment is collegiality. And this could be found at all levels of engagement. If I focus on the senior common room as the embodiment of that collegiality, I do so because, as I said a few weeks ago, it was my home away from home. Therefore, I salute all the pillars of that establishment, which unfortunately no longer exists in the form in which I knew it. All of those who afforded me comfort and ease and diversion. People like Mrs. Gaskin and Hazel, the late Teddy Rice and Roy Braffett. All the members of the Friday Night Fish Line, Keith Hunt will remember that very well. All those who played dominoes and table tennis and bridge. I was part of all of these, not necessarily a distinguished part, but a part of all of that. I have a little story to tell, which might or might not capture a little of that spirit. There was a gardener, I'm reminded his name was Farrell, who must have been present from the opening of the campus, and who was ever ready for conversation and for a sip. And as you would expect, he spent a lot of time around the senior common room, especially when there was a fete going on. One night, I was leaving the senior common room after a fete, and this was about midnight, when I saw him weaving around outside the senior common room. And naturally, I offered him a lift. And naturally, he accepted it. And he directed me to his home, which he claimed to be off Green Hill. So I drove there, found the road that he pointed out to me, but after searching around for about 15 minutes, he could not locate his house. At that point, Seeing my irritation, he told me to stop the car, and he got out, but not before insisting, Dr. Marshall, you can't tell anybody about this. Collegiality was, of course, not confined to the senior common room, though, of course, for obvious reasons, it flourished there. In the 20 years that I was actively involved in campus matters, I knew from early on that most colleagues in the department and in the faculty were willing to work as a team. And when I say colleagues, I mean colleagues in the widest possible sense. I mean, I include then what you used to call the non-academic staff, as well as the academic staff. And I would extend that, of course, to the administrative staff as well. And I'm, of course, very pleased to see a number of them here today. Vilma Harper particularly. I'm glad to see you here. And Sardis is around somewhere as well, yes. And I'm sure that there are one or two others. We tried to get Joel Evanson, she here? I don't know, apparently not. I'm sure that, but anyhow, there were Grace Franklin, didn't come either? No? Okay. And I mean, and I need to say, therefore, that because of all of that support, it follows that I share the honor with all of you. And of course, I need to say that as well in relation to the academic staff. I found on my arrival here in 1970 that there were, of course, some heavy hitters, you might say. People like Richard Alsop, Keith Hunt, Tony Phillips, Dennis Sardina, Bruce St. John, Charles Hollingsworth. And that number was later increased with the arrival of people like Martin Fido and Arthur Drayton. But while there was vigorous discussion at the faculty board, there was always full engagement. And perhaps even more important, there was adherence to whatever consensus was established, which of course was unlike the situation that we knew to exist in some other faculties. Indeed, a reading of the faculty board minutes of the 1970s might not indicate the extent of our disagreements or even the lack of clarity in some of our discussions. The reason for this is not difficult to find. We had in our secretary, Wilfred Beckles, who gave me his apologies this morning, we had in him one of those rare birds, and another one is Ed Brandon, who is here, one of those rare birds who could pick sense out of apparent nonsense, and who would then present minutes which gave structure and coherence to the discussion when, if you were there, you were not really aware of it. But more than that, he reported very clearly not what you said, but what you should have said. We'll do. I must also, of course, mention Victor Cook, the tight-fisted Victor Cook. We all knew him as, the great guardian of the finances. And though, of course, he was clearly parsimonious, I mean, some of us, and I did discover, that once a case was clearly presented to him, and therefore he could buy into it, he was therefore very generous in funding whatever proposal you had. So that he too must be regarded as playing a role in that team, which of course allowed us to do whatever we managed to accomplish. I have another little story which indicates the support which was forthcoming from colleagues. And this is support of a different sort. And it came from, and he probably doesn't remember, it came from Keith Hunt, who perhaps unwittingly provided it sometime in the 1970s, early 1970s. I had been behaving rather badly at a meeting of vigor, jeering at the interventions made by the then secretary, and I won't identify him except to say he came from the law faculty. And he got progressively annoyed with my behavior. And at the close of the meeting, he seemed, at least to my mind, prepared to punctuate the exchanges with violence. Now, he outweighed me by about 60 pounds. And at best, I'm a physical coward. But fortunately, I was in the presence of Hunt. I mean, it is just possible that he was just only making threats, that is, the secretary, the upset secretary. But as he kept on advancing towards me somewhat menacingly, I did what I thought I should do. I kept edging closer and closer to Hunt. And therefore managed to successfully nullify the threat. Thank you, Katie. Finally, let me say that while I had a job on this campus, I never regarded it as a chore. I enjoyed doing what I had to do. And if in the process I did manage to make a positive impact on some matters, you could say that it was done mainly out of self-interest. What I mean by that is this, that naturally I had an interest in improving my environment, the conditions in my environment, because it was my environment. And because the better that environment could be, the more comfortable and satisfied I would be. So that if my small interventions also produce a similar effect for other persons, well then I am doubly happy. Thank you very much.
Initially, I was very tentative about turning to verse, as I sometimes do, to capture the essence of what was said here this morning. But having heard from Professor Ball of your prowess as a bard, I'm less tentative, and I therefore turn to an extract from Martin Carter. Not in the saying of you are you said, but enduring you change with the change that changes, and yet are not of the changing of any of you, ever yourself. Thank you. I now invite all of you to witness the veiling of the signage of the building which will be named in honor of Sir Woodville. Following that, we will be having the second section of our program, our book launch, the launch of the book From Plantations to University Campus, The Social History of Cape Hill, Barbados. And you will hear of Sir Woodville's involvement of that as well in the continuing tradition. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
But we were blessed, though, in our 50th year of our campus to have Woodville Marshall available to us, because in conceptualizing how the celebration ought to go, and I wish to thank Andrew Lewis for his chairmanship of the 50th anniversary committee that gave birth to most of the things that we have done, and all members of that committee. We recognize that while it is important to look to the future, and to imagine KFIL at 60, because already there are the younger generation on the campus who are imagining KFIL at 60 and strategically planning for that. That in looking to the future of the campus and the university, it's important to look at the space and the history of the space itself. Now, unlike Mona and St. Augustine, we had very peasant beginnings. It's important because, you know, Mona was the home of a 3,500 acre estate. And how blessed the university, of course, was to have received 500 acres of beautiful prime space on which to build the Mona campus. So, you know, for us, Mona is a great estate, a beautiful, magnificent estate, well chosen in the valley, over, you know, under the Blue Mountains. It's a wonderful location. The St. Augustine campus, slightly diminished, 300 acres, a large tract of the savannah. And when you examine the savannah, you look at the beautiful savannah, then you realize why some of the Venezuelans recognize it. It has that continental rainforest look about it, the beautiful sprawl of the St. Augustine savannah. But we at KFIL, we started with 60 acres of rabland, assembled in a very creative way, you know, 10 acres here, 15 of this, 10 of this, and 60 acres well put together. And then, of course, the government have now given us an extra 30 acres, so we now move up to 100. So we are ambitious. And we have our minister here who has assured us that this is not the end of the story. So we have grown, you know, we've grown to 60, now we're 95, and, you know, and we are inching up there, but, you know, the race is not for the swiftest. So the putting together of the KFIL campus in that way meant that by stitching together pockets of pieces of land, some occupied, some not occupied, brings a history to it. And so we decided to commission Woodville to do a thorough and complete history of the environment that is now the KFIL campus and its environs. And to do that, as far as the records will allow, to go back into the 17th century, when Barbados is colonized by the British, when the colonial societies put together, when the slavery system emerged, when the slavery system is dismantled in the 1830s, right through to our contemporary moments. And as you can imagine, that is a formidable task. Even for the most skilled historian and the most informed person on these archives, it is a formidable task. But no one knows the archives as well as Woodville. And he has been able to construct this social history of the KFIL campus community in a very detailed and meticulous fashion. And we can now see the significance of a university campus arising out of slave plantations, peasant holdings, commercial farms, rabland, a university, a center of learning emerging out of an extraordinary space like that. And Pedro mentioned the story of Kwa, which Woodville unearthed for us. And it's an extraordinary story. You can go to the monument here at the front of the campus, Kwa's Quest, and you can read it for yourself. A young child, about 3 years old, coming out of Guinea as a child, being brought to Barbados, just an infant. And we can track who bought him, who owned him, his early life. He becomes free at emancipation. He gets married. He has 3 or 4 daughters. Then he becomes the first black sexton of St. Stephen's Church, which is a fascinating story in itself, that he arrives as an infant, a child, in a slavery circumstance. And one can only assume that if he arrives here as an enslaved child, what would have happened to his parents in Guinea? We can only imagine that, but he survives it. He survives it, and he puts his life together at emancipation. He gets married, he has his family, he rebuilds his family, and then he becomes a professional man in the church. And that is the story that is so fascinating. And we are quite sure that there must be hundreds of stories like this based on this environment. People who live here, grew here, and the campus is now resting on this legacy. And so we were fortunate to have had Woodville, because we did not wish just to produce a coffee table pictorial book. We did that for our 40th year, and it's a wonderful collection of the history of the campus in epic pictures. But we wanted a different kind of history. We wanted to tell the story of where our campus originated, how it emerged, and the communities on which it grew in association with, and in some instances by displacing. But basically to show how this campus has grown. So Woodville, we thank you so very much for doing this for us. It's a magnificent piece of work. And while it is, I should say this, while it is available commercially, I will say that the campus has purchased 500 copies of this book, and we will give those 500 copies to all of the people at the Cayfield campus who have worked so hard in the 50th year, all of our stalwarts, all of our community people. So it is really, in fact, something for us. This is not a commercial product. It is a gift to the Cayfield campus community, and we will make sure that it is widely distributed. But those of you who will receive a copy by right, you should buy 2 copies because Christmas is here. The copy is for you, but you must buy for your friends and your family. And that is your way of supporting the Cayfield campus. I thank you, Woodville. Thank you.
Just before I invite the man of the hour himself to say a few words about the project, again, it would be remiss of me not to just step back into the history of the Department of History and to say a few words about our encounter with Sir Woodville. Those of us who attended at the time that I did this campus entered the Department of History where there were there's one foundational history course, H101, and then that was followed by a course, History of the West Indies, H201. And those of us who entered that course, H201, had our first encounter with what we call the insistence on scholarship. We entered H201, and I remember in the very first tutorial, when many of us had not prepared for the discussion, and that very first tutorial, this gentleman with a Liberty shirt said to us, next time you must not come unprepared, otherwise we will not have a class. And then he said something that said, you must make me redundant. That meant, of course, that we had to get involved in the scholarship ourselves and to begin to investigate what was going on. Those of us who listened very carefully to his admonition, some of us were privileged then to move on to a third course, H304, Society and Economy in the British Caribbean, which was a course which prepared those of us who eventually aspired to the position of historian. And those of us who did that course will often remember some of the encounters we had. Richard Goodrich, who is here with me, will remember very well that in that class we had some of the encounters and some of the confrontations that would put in a certain place in our minds the view that this was a man who was prepared to put before the firing squad if that was required. I remember on one occasion a question was posed by Sir Woodville, and we had no answers. We went all around the class, and each person trying to wrap their minds around this thing. And then finally, I was a little bit frustrated, a little bit annoyed. And I said to him, Professor Marshall, but what's your view? He looked at me for about a moment or so, and then he said, next point. But then we got the message. It was that not everything could be answered with the resources that you had then. But it was important to discuss the issue and to try to find some answers. If you didn't find the answers, then go and look again. And that is what he's really saying to us. And I want to thank him very much for those early beginnings. Those of us who were in that class, there's some of us who were in that class, we eventually came here, and our footsteps seem to be following his to some extent. Without any further ado, therefore, I want to call the Gamaliel of the Department of History. I want to call the one who took many of us and placed us on a trajectory to the class of historian, Sir Woodville Marshall.
Well, you've already heard what the remit was. In fact, the remit, I think, when I looked at the contract last night, was even larger than what Professor Beckles has just said, because, in fact, I was noticing for the first time, it seemed to me for the first time, that apart from providing the social history, I was being charged to provide a measure of the value of Cave Hill as a heritage site. And there's a third one as well, provide a source for future scholarly research. So that was really the remit. Now, in reflecting on it last night, I decided that to some extent, I discharge or try to discharge the first and the third bits of the remit. That is to try to write the social history. And because I wrote a social history, because I wrote a book, well then naturally I could provide a source for future scholarly research, particularly if in fact you notice the deficiencies in the book, well then of course naturally it becomes a source. So and B, the measure of the value of the heritage site, well I know, well I didn't do that, but of course there will be materials in the book which obviously will help the search, and I know that Tara and company are already investigating that. Now, I don't really need to give you, and I won't try to give you, a précis of the book, but I would like just to indicate very, very quickly what I was trying to do in discharging the remit that I was given. What I tried to do was to identify the main social groups, to look at their economic activities, whether they were done jointly or separately, at the nature and the extent of the interaction between these social groups, and also too at some aspects of the lifestyle of each group. And of course, Pedro, of course, has indicated some of the sorts of things that, in fact, that I mentioned. I say aspects because obviously, given one, the time constraint that I had, and to some extent also the nature of the materials that I had at my disposal, we couldn't, in fact, go into as much detail as perhaps was required. So the central issue that I think that is addressed in the book is the changes in land owning and land use patterns in the space, and particularly the extent to which all of these were impacted by slave emancipation. So basically, therefore, I set it up by trying to identify what existed in the 17th and in the 18th century, until therefore you get to slave emancipation. And then because slave emancipation introduced an element of mobility in the population which was never before present, well then of course certain important changes followed. So therefore that's the nature of that impact becomes important in the book. This, a subsidiary issue you might say, is the extent to which Cave Hill, broadly defined, and that's an issue which of course I take up in the book. You know, what is Cave Hill space? What is the Cave Hill space? And I wouldn't go into that. I mean, you should go and read the book to see what I have to say about that. But Cave Hill, broadly defined, which might be regarded for the moment as Black Rock, was not typical plantation country. We use plantation in the title, partly at the insistence of the principal, but also too because when you look at the deeds and when you have a sense of definitions of the 17th century and even of the 18th century, any clearing in the bush, no matter how large, was a plantation. Okay, so in that sense, and in fact, in the debate that I had with Hillary, we decomposed it really on that basis. Because I was saying this is not really typical plantation country that we're on. He said Rabland. You know what I mean? So it was not typical plantation country, but you can still use plantation because of the way that particular term was used, and it was being used almost in a legal sense. Okay, so my point then is that, and this is another part of the subtext of the book, that this is not typical plantation country, and it meant therefore that in it you would find some urban features. For a number of reasons. It's not typically plantation country, so that therefore you expect certain patterns of social and particularly economic behavior. But then when you put to that proximity to Bridgetown, well then of course you could understand then why urban features might in fact intrude. And therefore when you particularly go and look at this slavery institution, and I would suggest, without going into a great deal of detail, that the slavery institution in the space has a lot of the features of urban slavery. And Pedro, of course, might want to take me up on that at some stage. Also, because it's not typically plantation country, it meant, of course, that once, in fact, the slave system was ended, there was a chance in the space for certain social transformations which were not so evident elsewhere in Barbados. In other words, it was possible for villages to emerge. So that when you look at this particular space, you will find that for St. Michael, this is the area of village activity. This is the area of village activity. And it has obviously to do with the nature of the terrain and what I call, therefore, the untypical character in terms of plantation. So these then are, you might say, some of the themes that are developed in the course of the book. Naturally, of course, I pay some attention to some detail, some little detail, and there are two bits of detail which I think are important. One is a close look at life inside communities in the space. And the communities in the space that I'm talking about are basically two, just down the hill here, Free Hill just down the hill here, and the associated area which you might call the Mount, which is where we are at the moment. And we had the benefit of some oral history interviews, which of course gave us some insight into what was going on. So that basically, therefore, what that chapter in the book does is to look at what the area, the living area, the social space in a living sense, what it was like just before the university came. And I think that there's some important things in that in that material. And finally, as Hillary mentioned, I speak to the putting together of the various pieces of land to make the campus. And then again, another set of issues are involved here, because as Hillary mentioned, a certain amount of dispossession did in fact take place. And while it is proven a little bit difficult to investigate the extent to which that caused serious problems, one can imagine that for some people it was a problem. In other words, some individuals might have thought that the coming of the university imposed a hardship. Now, it is a point, therefore, we have to some extent to take on board. Now, the materials are clear. It is obvious what the type of materials that I'm using here. The materials that I was using are basically archival, had to be archival for obvious reasons. The deeds and the wills, to some extent, maps and newspapers. This is it. And to some extent, one was constrained. I was constrained in terms of the examination by the nature of some of the materials. Not so much the nature of the materials, the absence of some of the materials. I mean, Is David Williams still here? Yeah, he's still here, yes. Because, I mean, we couldn't, in fact, go into the type of detail that we would like to do, particularly to establish continuities, because some of the deeds volumes are closed. So that that's an area, therefore, that we might want to go back to when those deeds volumes become available. So those basically were the materials. So I mentioned already that we had the benefit of interviews, and those interviews were very, very useful. The final thing then that I would like to say is that there are, I think, and I like to believe that I'm a good critic of my own work, that there are some deficiencies in the book. One of them, Tara has pointed out already. She says there's a certain absence of illustrative material, photographs. I agree. I mean, not to move it in the direction of the coffee table book, but I mean, we could have used some more photographs. For example, it would have been very useful to have a photograph of some of the key players at various points of time. One of the things that I probably should have said, that there was a big plantation here in the 17th century, the Hallett's plantation. Okay, and we can identify the extent of the plantation, the location of the plantation. We know something too about John Hallett, who established the plantation. It would be good to be able to put his photograph in, because that is, in a sense, the foundation. In fact, Cave Hill appears for the first time in the record in one of the diagrams of that plantation. Cave Hill is there. So, I mean, but it's quite clear Cave Hill is up on the hill, but it's up on the hill in that direction. Okay, so that's important. Secondly, I mean, or rather, in that same vein, it would have been useful, and I tried hard to see if we could find a photograph of a man called Alexander Messiah Jones. Now, Alexander Messiah Jones is important at a later stage, at a very later stage in the history, because here was a schoolmaster. I mean, this, of course, has certain certain relevance for some of us here. He was a schoolmaster, but more important, he lived in this area. When at the entrance, his line stretched from the bottom of the hill right up to the brow of the hill, and incidentally, he was the grandfather of Oliver Jackman. And so it is important to look at him because of his varied activity, schoolmaster, but also entrepreneur. He did a number of things, I have written a few pages about him. And Hillary knows, of course, that I have proposed that there is a case for renaming the little piece of road, from the roundabout back to the brow of the hill, Alexander Messiah Jones Drive. And we know that the minister is here. Perhaps he will give us, yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, the other thing that, the other deficiency, I mentioned it briefly before, is the lack of continuities of a certain sort. Now, it is one thing to establish who owned land in the 17th century, and even who owned land in the 18th century. But it would be important, I think, to tell the story in a coherent fashion, to see what happens to the land owning from one period to another. So those who owned land earlier, what happened to them? I mean, and I think that the book is a little bit deficient in the sense that is not carried through to the extent that we might have done. So you might say, therefore, that is an area for further work, that we can, in fact, perhaps, provided we can find the deeds, we can, in fact, look more closely at those land owning patterns. So, in saying all of that, then I think that a little bit of our agenda for research can be identified. One, of course, is we mentioned already by both Hillary and Pedro, is core. We have managed, partly because of what the principal wanted us to produce, we have managed to assemble some materials on core. We have also managed to assemble materials, but only in a very skeletal way, on all the enslaved persons in the space at 1834. So that is, and those names are down there in Qua's quest. But we should take it further. Obviously, we should take it further. I know the principal intends to take it further. So that the first thing is to continue the work in relation to Qua. Okay, and because more could be done about Qua. We know he had a family. Well, what happened to the family? And secondly, extending that point would be then to take up all of those names, grouping them in families in that list down there, and to see what we can recover about all of them. And again, I know that the principal has that project in mind. And the third thing, of course, which is not directly related, but it seems to me important, is in fact to take then the Cave Hill story to the next stage. That is the institutional history. And I think that, that is now, in a sense, also due, and I would like to volunteer, even at this stage, to do it. Thank you.
Some of the history in 1950s certainly is a history that I'm very familiar with, because of course there was no Cave Hill campus, and as Sir Woodville has pointed out, Cave Hill was somewhere a little further away. For those of us who lived near the Prospect area and who used to walk up on the ground up here, this was known as Dunk Tree Mountain, because there were hundreds, if not thousands, of dunk trees in this area. And that's a little further to the north. There was a flat area where in the days before we had television, we used to go to watch the mobile cinema on the pasture down there, the Lazaretto, and watch Budaloo and all those other things that go along with it. Thank you again for attending this ceremony. I am sure that Sir Woodville would certainly be quite willing to sign, autograph, or copy of the book. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.